right, hello everyone. I'm joined today by the Irate Libertarian for episode 21 of the Gumtree of Liberty live podcast to talk about liberty unity. How are you going, mate?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, good. I wanted to talk first, before we get onto liberty and unity, a couple of things that that have been in the news recently about Scotland. The first one being, of course, what happened with that whole witch thing, because I'll pull up the Daily Mail story on it, because I I was surprised when I heard the story come out about Nicola Sturgeon apparently apologising to the witches who had died in the last 400, 500 years in Scotland. So I'll just quickly pull up that news article and I'll read that out, and then I wanted to get your thoughts on it and also how it was received by the people of Scotland, I guess, as well, because from what we heard of it, it didn't. It was like there was one poll went around on Twitter that said that I think it was 90% said it was like it was a stupid thing to do to apologise to witches on International Women's Day. So according to the Daily, they ran with the headline: Nicola Sturgeon to witches, First Minister formal apology to women who suffered injustice by misogyny when they were burned at the stake 400 years ago. And then it goes through to talk about, there were 4,000 witches burned at the stake between 1563 and 1736. 85% were female. And apparently it was driven by sexism and misogyny. So I wanted to get your thoughts. That was obviously, for those of us who haven't lived in, for those countries of us that haven't had witches to that extent, I guess the US, Australia, for example, New Zealand. How is that received by the general public and by the media?
So, I mean, generally, it's a non-story, and it's Nicola Sturgeon looking for some sort of attention. And the way you get attention, especially on Day of International Women's Day, it's to give out some platitude about something that you had no involvement in. She's apologizing for something she didn't do, her family probably didn't do, and making it. I mean, there was definitely an element of misogyny in it, but a lot of it was specifically elderly women pretty much all the time. Though you did have younger ones. A lot of people were accused of being witches just because they were associated with other witches, including the men who were killed. And it came from this sort of religious fanaticism about not living alternative lifestyles, not being single women, also about healers who often prescribed you with potions they'd mix up because it was actually safer than going to a doctor at the time. If people would go to those healers and they'd have a bad reaction, they'd say, "Oh, that's a witch." And an enormous amount of the accusations came from other women who had some spite against their neighbor and would try and bring them down by accusing them of being a witch, because once you're accused, it's very difficult to prove that you're not. And in most cases, you're tortured until you say that you are.
So I'm guessing that when they confessed, it was all forced, and a bit like the Spanish Inquisition and how they forced confessions about anything if you tortured long enough, really.
Yeah.
So was it a religious thing, or exactly what motivated them? Yeah.
So there's a big religious divide in Scotland at the time, and you had, because this was in the early modern period, you had this division growing in England between Protestantism and Catholicism. And within the Protestant group, there were the Puritans, who were of like Calvinist tradition and were very focused on social order and behaving within this very strict society. And if you didn't behave in that way, so at the time you could be fined if you didn't go to church every Sunday. There were like stories of women who'd wear men's clothes. They were accused of being witches because they had to wear the right sort of outfits. People who engaged with things like astrology would be accused of witchcraft because it didn't fit with this Puritan social order.
Yeah. And the other story I wanted to talk about before we get into unity is the no-fly zone. So again, Nicola Sturgeon has been in the news a lot, I guess, called for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. So how does Scotland see the struggle in Ukraine, and is all the, I guess, 4 countries of the UK in agreement, or is there division between, say, Sturgeon and Boris Johnson, for example, in England?
The UK is pretty united both politically and in terms of the general population in their support for Ukraine. I've been out to several rallies in Edinburgh, the solidarity ones, and a vigil at the Ukrainian consulate. And there's people who show up. They're Scottish, they're Polish, Ukrainian, there are even Russians there. And people coming together to condemn this war as people and saying, I'm not out there right now, so I can't be fighting, but this is what I can do for my family or for their friends. And there's not really any clear division between countries, though I say Sturgeon's probably a bit more aggressive than Boris Johnson. He's not committed to a no-fly zone. And the thing is, Sturgeon can say, we need a no-fly zone, but she isn't actually the one who's enforcing that in the end, which is the benefit of not being in charge of the whole UK, is you can talk about things like foreign policy and make your point clear without having to make the tough call yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense, I guess. So they don't have much authority then as, is it First Minister? Or what is her title then?
First Minister.
First Minister. So I'm guessing they don't have
She's
much.
the First Minister of Scotland.
So would that be a bit like the state system in the UK and the US, or is it a more unitary?
Yeah, there are definitely similarities, and Scotland functions much more like a US state than, say, Wales does, because they do have their own parliament, but Scotland's parliament has more power. But things like, obviously, foreign policy decision and military, there are reserved matters that are kept in Westminster, and then devolved matters which are given to Holyrood, which is the Scottish Parliament.
Yep, gotcha. So I guess on that, so are those parties united, or are they divided into caucuses like the US parties are, or are they more, because in Australia, for example, we don't have this. We don't have the caucus system. What we have is the MPs obviously have the left and the right and centre factions of each party, but there's no real division amongst the rank and file. Is that the same in Scotland, or is it similar to the US system instead with caucuses?
So we don't have caucuses in the UK. We have interest groups within parties. Most famous ones are in the Conservative Party. They have the 1922 committee, which is a committee of backbenchers. So it gives them a louder voice, so they can, if the ministers are doing something they don't agree with, they can take it to the ministers. And they used to have the ERG, which was the European Research Group, who were one of the main conservative groups that lobbied the party to support Brexit. Now they have the CRG, the COVID Recovery Group, who are the anti-lockdown Tories, but it's nowhere near the same as the US caucus system. You basically just have a group of friends within your party who you align with. And then on the front bench, regardless of what group you were in before, you abandon that entirely. We have, for ministers, collective responsibility. If the cabinet does something, even if you disagree with it violently, you either resign or you go out there and you defend it to the death.
So I guess there's no real chance to speak your own conscience then. So is that divide shared by members, or is that just an MP thing?
Well, within party members, there's always division and much more diversity of opinion, and just based on where people come from as well. Like Conservatives in the north of England and Conservatives in Scotland have different views to Conservatives in the south of England. So within the party membership, there's often big divides, but that never means anything until it comes to electing a party leader, because that's pretty much all they do. I know in the US, party membership has a lot more involvement when it comes to elections, because they have the primaries and caucuses where they go along and they can debate, lobby, and vote. But here we don't really have that. When it comes to choosing a leader, you cast your vote as a party member, and then that's your contribution.
I guess that brings on to the topic of unity then. You mentioned before the show that there was a bit of a leadership spill in the Scottish Libertarian Party. So how does that work for those who don't understand how that sort of system works?
Yeah, so I mean, when we agreed to do this show, I think I made a tweet. I was pointing out how, because Scottish libertarianism is such a small movement, we're much more able to unite. And then a few weeks later, found out that someone in the party had challenged the leader for his leadership. And it looks, at the moment and at the start, looks like a very personal dispute. Um, and I was a little concerned at the start that it was going to cause a rift in a party that isn't big enough to have a rift like that. But it does seem to have remained personal. All of the other members who I talk about aren't talking about who they're going to support in the upcoming leadership election. They're not getting in fights over it. It's not even really a massive disagreement over policy like you have in the US, where the Mises Caucus have very, very different ideas to, say, I think, is it the Radical Caucus? I'm not sure if they exist anymore. But there isn't that sort of ideological division. There are two people who generally agree on most things, as most of the party do, and would like to see the party be the best it can be. And that's something shared by the membership to the point that they're willing to stay united, even in the midst of a power struggle within the upper ranks.
Yeah, I guess that unity divide is that unity in the party is the same thing that we have over here in Australia. Is that the party is much more willing to rally around the leadership than I guess it is in the US system. Back when we agreed to do the show, it was actually during the Twitter spats of December of last year. Obviously, there was the one about whether you should drink, whether I think is it rape to drink to give a woman 12 shots of alcohol and then sleep with her. Is that Canada's rape if it is the consent valid? And then the other one about is it fine to use the police to arrest the homeless people that are being a nuisance in the park? And that I think they spent must have been 3 weeks on those two issues on Twitter. So most of December was spent fighting about those two things, and I was really really like confused as to exactly how they're fighting for those things. Why do you think it is that they're more divided than say the Scottish and the British systems? Is for me? I believe it's more of a focus on, as you said, the Scottish Party is quite small. It's the same over here. Do they have any MPs in any government level at all?
We have one councillor, but he defected from the Conservative Party, and his wife, I think, wants him to retire from politics. So not any major representation. But you look at the electoral statistics, we're growing. More and more people every year hear about us, and the membership's growing as well.
Yeah.
And then I think the genesis of those debates in America comes from the fact that libertarians, pretty much all of us, had an edgy teenager phase. And our belief in free speech is one that leads us to make edgy jokes and keep those edgy jokes up. And there are edgy jokes within the private group chats for the Scottish Libertarian Party, but we don't have big names going around and making those jokes to the general public when they might not like them. Even if they do, it's jokes between friends. If you don't like the joke, don't laugh at it. So we're not going to tear our party apart over jokes, because we don't have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of members. We have, I think, about 400, though I'm not entirely sure. And if we split up that into two camps of 200 people who aren't sure what they think about someone's joke, you're destroying a party that isn't even big enough to win seats in the parliament yet. And that same thing applies to the Libertarian Party in America. They're not big enough to be dividing themselves like this. They're acting like they have as much power as the Republicans and Democrats, who are equally divided and very prone to infighting. But they have so much power and such a strong grip on that power that they can infight as much as they want, and it won't threaten their existence.
Yeah, I know that our Libertarian Party, the Lib Dems, which is the Liberal Democrats, which aren't the same as the UK one, they're Libertarian. The UK one definitely isn't. The approach that we take over here is similar. So we've got 2 MPs in the Victorian Senate, and that's it. But we did have a federal senator at one point. I guess it's easier having preferential voting to get them elected. But it's the same thing over here. There's a lot more of a unity focus, even though we have some electoral success. We're still a pretty small party compared to the US system. It's mostly located in New South Wales and in Victoria, compared to the US, where I think they got 3 or 4% of the vote in 2016 federally, which is well over 1 million voters, probably a couple million voters. And I think for me that comes down to dividing over theory versus uniting over being pragmatic. Is there much of a focus on theory in the UK?
Not in the party's public image or in the public image of any party, because generally the public don't care about philosophy or ideology. That's incredibly niche when you go out into actual society. When you go out to touch some grass and talk to some real people, they couldn't care less. But if you can show them the outcome of your theory in policies that are pragmatic and work within the system, I have this flag behind me. The party aren't saying, you know what, we're going to demolish all government buildings, take out the government officials and shoot them. We're saying, right, here's how we're going to reduce spending. We're going to massively cut military spending. We're not going to be an interventionist country anymore. We're going to have drug legalization, firearms reform, policies that people can look at, understand what they are, and don't have to have read the entire library of the Mises Institute.
Yes, I remember seeing that. Even Nick Sarwark of the US Libertarian Party, like when I said, "I'll stop airing your dirty laundry" on Twitter, leave it for behind closed doors, he got quite upset about that. But I do see it similarly to you in that it is more about what can we do to be successful as a party and to limit government, as opposed to let's split over whether or not you should use the police to remove homeless people from the park and divide over that for a week and a half and ban anyone who disagrees with you and don't allow debate, which I think is very unusual for everyone else, because libertarian parties outside of America don't seem to have that same divide. So how does your party work then, the Scottish Libertarian Party? How do they work at elections? How does campaigning work then? Because with the US system, they put their conventions in every state, and then a federal convention to determine who the party leader is, and who the presidential and vice presidential candidate's going to be. So how does it work in the UK system?
So if you want to be a candidate for a party, you have to first be a member, and then second, send in an application. If the party accepts your application, pretty much every party, I think, has to have a nominations officer who just runs all the paperwork for the Electoral Commission, gets you on the ballot, and then off you go. Now, the bigger parties will give you a nice chunk of money to go and campaign with. That isn't something we can really afford as a party. So if you want to actually go out, campaign, canvass, leaflet, you're encouraged to, print your own leaflets, and that's called donations in kind. So it's another way of donating to the party other than just giving them money. But currently, for us at our size, we're looking at a lot of paper candidacy. So getting somebody's name for the Scottish Libertarian Party in most areas so people see it. So there's council elections coming up in May, and I'm running for the Edinburgh Council. And I think based on the candidates from last time, if it's in alphabetical order, my name will be at the top of the ballot paper with the party name. Now, if I go out and talk to people about the party, they'll learn something. If I don't, and they look at it and they think, who are the Scottish Libertarians? And they go home and they Google it. Maybe they'll hate us, but maybe they won't. And it's just about people knowing who we are, trying to become a household name. The other thing with that as well is, if you're a conservative voter who is into your theory and ideology, you're going to know what a libertarian is. You're going to look at that ballot paper where I think you get two choices, you rank them, and you're going to say, well, there you go, that's my second choice.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what we've got over here is quite similar in terms of getting in name on the ballot paper. I know that one of the reasons why we get elected is because we've got the Liberal Party, which is our Conservatives, and then you have the Lib Dems. So it's the exact same Liberal at the start. It's actually been a High Court challenge by the Liberal Party to get that name change, and I believe they were successful. So it's changing to Liberty and Democracy Party. But before that, when we had an election 2013 for federal Senate, Libertarian got elected, and his name was on top of that. His was the exact same thing as you. The first name on the ballot paper was his, with the party being the Liberal Democrat. So and he thinks that's how he got the votes. Is you're being first on the ballot paper. So when people reading it, they're going to associate, look at that party name first and say, okay, I'll vote for them. And again, having that preference system, which I don't think they have in the US. And I know that our preferential system is more developed than the UK one, the Scottish one. But having that, the benefit of that, I guess, is that you do get some votes from people who are going to vote Conservative, and then from there vote Libertarian as number 2. So on that, is the Scottish Libertarian Party, are you guys right or centre, or where do you guys fall roughly? I know the political spectrum is very complex and usually isn't a good way to describe a party, but where do you guys fall roughly on issues like economics and stuff?
Economically, like on the traditional right of modern politics. On social issues, it's that old thing about gay marijuana farmers defending their fields with AR-15s. We're a socially accepting party. We have very, very conservative members, and we have very, very progressive members, and they're able to agree on the fact that freedom is a good thing. And freedom is such a huge concept and such an important thing that you can actually unite a party over that, even when people have personal preferences. The party itself doesn't really talk about being on the right. We talk about being a party for freedom for all people, regardless of what flavor that's in, because there's generally a stigma about the right in a lot of British politics, and then there's a stigma about the left in a lot of British politics. And we come in and say, right, let's tear up this sheet of the political spectrum and offer you something different, offer you something for you and for your freedom.
Yeah, because if you divide left, right, I guess it makes it all black and white. I know we have the problem of, because our conservatives are to the left of the Republican Party in America, and the US watches, the Australians watch the US elections very closely in that, and usually to the point of being a 51st state is what we're called sometimes, is that we'll, end up being cast in terms of, it's left or right, black or white on a variety of issues, and, our libertarians get cast as being hard right, to the right of the Liberal Party, and of course, as an anarchist, I'm seen as being fascist, which is unfortunately how it works. Is it the same stigma around libertarians in Scotland, or in the UK more generally?
In Scotland and the UK, it's pretty much the same. That if someone knows what a libertarian is, they'll say you're on the right or the hard right. Then you explain to them why that isn't necessarily the case, and they won't have it. And then I tell someone I'm an anarchist. I don't get accused of fascism for being an anarchist, but I'm told I'm on the hard left. Told I'm a communist, which is all absolutely wrong. But people aren't willing to not think in a black and white way. So the party are characterized as on the right by those who know about us. And you look at the economic policy, and it is an economic policy associated with the modern right, but it's also the economic policy of large portions of the left when the term left wing was invented in the French Revolution.
Yeah, I used to go by ANCAP, and now I go by anarchist, because there's a stigma around being an ANCAP of being some crazy corporatist, which is ridiculous. And then you go anarchist, and same thing. You're no longer right wing; you're now left wing. In a hard right party, you're a left wing anarchist, which I think is, I don't get the logic, but it is interesting. I know in the UK, you guys have, in Scotland, you have the issue of the two major issues I think that I've seen, independence and Brexit. Although I guess Brexit's died down a bit since the UK left the EU. Compared that to, say, the US, where I think that the biggest issues that divide people, aside from all the minor spats on Twitter, are borders and abortion. So, how do you guys line up on independence? I guess start with that first. How do you guys line up on independence issues, and is there a party divide over that, or is it generally more united on that issue?
So, being a political party, we have to accept the democratic position, and there was a referendum on independence. So the party says it supports the result of that referendum. That's what the people voted for. But it is a party that is pro-independence. In fact, it is the only Scottish party that is actually pro-independence, because they also don't want a Scottish membership of the EU. But there are people in the party who, whilst agreeing that Scotland should be an independent nation and then that would be good for freedom, would not vote to leave the UK, because what it would mean was you leave the UK and the government you've ended up with is the SNP. There's no check from Westminster anymore. And the SNP aren't ready to make the economic reforms necessary for Scotland to thrive independently, and they try and drive the country right into the European Union. Personally, I'm actually undecided how I would vote. I would tend towards voting for independence. It's my belief that the SNP will lose a lot of their selling point if Scotland is independent, because at that point, what are they selling? Other than the European Union, they're no longer a Scottish nationalist party. They are a European party who want to hand over sovereignty back to the EU. So that would lead me to towards voting for independence, though it could be a very difficult opening era for New Scotland.
Yeah, that's actually, it makes sense being anti-EU and anti-EU and anti-UK. I think and correct me if I'm wrong, but the SNP is anti-Brexit and officially pro being part of the UK. Am I correct on that?
They are against Brexit and want to be in the EU, but they want independence from Westminster, full independence. Though they have mostly accepted the referendum result, they are trying to get another referendum now that Brexit's happened, because they say Scotland didn't vote to leave the EU, which they didn't. The Scottish majority voted to remain. So they're using that as their selling point for why there should be another referendum.
It seems there's so many referendums to you guys for independence. Was there one? Was it 2016? Was the last one just before Brexit?
Yes, 2016 was the Brexit referendum. The Scottish independence referendum was 2014, which is why the SNP say they were robbed of independence because Brexit hadn't happened yet.
So how do you guys get portrayed then as being anti-EU, which is seen as being a right-wing stance, but being pro-independence, which is seen as being a left-wing stance? How do you guys deal with that, of being in that position of being accused of being on both sides on these issues?
Well, the issue is that we're not getting presented as much as we'd like to be. We're not a major party in the media, other than when Count Dankula ran for the Scottish Parliament for the party. That attracted several newspapers to it because they knew who he was. He's a familiar face. And he was characterized as far right, former UKIP, which he was. They brought up his dog doing something. I can't quite remember what his dog did, but that sort of characterized the party on the far right in the media, and for a lot of people, that was their first introduction. So what we're trying to do is, get the party name on a ballot. Someone goes home and Googles us. They look at the website, a Wikipedia page even, and they see the party and they make a judgment for themselves. And if they look at the point about independence and they say, well, you know what, they do have a point. If Scotland leaves the UK and then hands over all of those former powers held by Westminster straight over to Brussels, they're even further away. They're even less accountable. It's an even bigger organization, and it seems to be growing. Who knows what they'll take in the future. So with devolution in the UK at the moment, it's practically irreversible. If Westminster were to take back any powers they'd given to Scotland, there would be such a massive uproar The government couldn't do it; they couldn't be re-elected, and Scotland would most likely drop out. But with the EU, they can keep passing laws, keep taking powers, keep making new rules. Yeah.
And I know, with as an experience as a former British colony, the approach taken post American Revolution was slowly give independence to the colonies to the point where they end up becoming part of the Commonwealth instead of being a dominion or a colony. Do you think we're going to see the same thing happening with the Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, or is England trying to cling on to those ones as best as it can, or is there going to be the same, slowly get self government and an independence approach to Scotland and I guess to Wales and Northern Ireland as well?
So Scotland, under the SNP wants independence, and if Scotland chooses independence, they're not going to be hostile to the UK as sort of the SNP are a very anti-English party more than they're pro-Scottish, but they know how to do diplomacy. There's a fair chance they'd be in the Commonwealth, get the benefits of being in the Commonwealth Games. They'd have lots of sports matches as they already do. Wales independence is looking very far off for Wales. Their parliament isn't nearly as developed as the Scottish one. Their government is held by Labour, who, whilst supporting the right to choose independence, aren't the Independence Party in Wales. That's Plaid Cymru, if I even pronounce that correctly. Northern Ireland, if Northern Ireland doesn't get independence at some point soon, it could turn very violent again. But they would, rather than independence, they want to rejoin the Republic of Ireland. They don't want an independent Ulster at the moment, though there is a very tiny movement for that. So they'd be joining Ireland and then adopting Ireland's relationship with the UK and foreign policy, etc.
Yeah. So when it comes to elections, then how would the SLP, I guess, how do you guys approach federal elections, or not federal, UK elections as opposed to Scottish elections? Do you guys have a presence at a national level, or are you guys a branch of some other party that runs
I
at
think
the UK level?
so. There used to be, well, there still is the LP UK, Libertarian Party UK, who then agreed that they would not field any candidates in Scotland, and they are a separate party from the Scottish Libertarian Party. So they LP UK run in England and in Wales, and then in Scotland that's all SLP, and they don't run any in England either. Now I think the SLP might have stood one candidate in a national general election before, though I'm not entirely sure. But mostly the focus is on Scotland. And now with elections coming up in May, it is on Scottish councils. If you get one seat on a Scottish council, someone, especially in a city like Edinburgh or Glasgow, someone's going to see that. Or even if you can fill up the number of candidates needed to have someone standing in every single council ward, people are going to know your name. People are going to start paying attention, and that's how you climb slowly but surely up the ladder.
So that's a little bit like the US approach then of running on all ballot paper, but also focusing on the council level, local level elections. Whereas it's different over here in Australia because we have a Senate with preferential voting and 12 senators per state, unlike the US's two with first past the post voting system. We don't worry about going for councils. We go straight for federal Senate. Whereas I think, as you're saying, I think it's the same for the US. It's focusing on those local council elections, getting your name out there first. How would it, for libertarians, is it better to work at a UK level or a Scotland level in the UK? So which level is better for libertarians?
In my opinion,
yeah.
My opinion is the Scottish level, because if you want to get a Scottish Libertarian candidate into the party in Westminster, into the Parliament in Westminster, you need about 20,000 people in a constituency to vote for you, which is a large number, and you're competing with recognised parties anyway. Even the Greens don't have a seat in Scotland. You have the SNP, Labour, the Conservatives, and the Liberal Democrats hold all the Scottish seats in Parliament. there is no way realistically they're being displaced by anyone except potentially a Green candidate at some point in the next few years. But smaller parties don't nearly do as well in national elections as they do on a local level. And you saw that with UKIP, the only times they got MPs were when Conservatives left the party and joined UKIP. They were unable to get people elected. But you go down to a council level, you had UKIP councillors popping up all over the place, showing that there was a demand for their sort of ideas, even though their main policy was leave the EU, and that's not something they can do from a council level. They have a presence then in the political sphere. So if you can build a presence on the council level in Scotland, and then hopefully build a presence in Holyrood, which is, that's the centre of Scottish politics, then you campaign for independence, and you push for libertarian policies at a local and national level within Scotland, but not trying to force any of those policies on the rest of the UK. So I don't think it's really worth trying to take Westminster. We're not going to establish a government. We won't have a prime minister, certainly not in the next few years. Yeah.
That's a very different approach to the US system of focusing. They focus so much on presidential elections, which I think is partly because that's how America's developed. But I know the US LP, so much of a focus on who's president compared to Westminster systems where we don't worry about that because the prime minister is a member of the biggest party in the lower house. Is it just one house? I take it it's just unicameral for Scotland, or is it bicameral, like with a upper house as well?
Just one house in Scotland.
Just one house.
Yeah, and they sit in Holyrood in Edinburgh, and there's just one, and they're all elected. Whereas in Westminster there are two.
But then again, House of Lords is all appointed mostly anyway, so it's not really a democratic system up there, I guess. Yeah, I think talking about defections, I think Justin Amash defected from the Republican Party to the Libertarian Party for a couple of years, and that's just the only time that they've gotten a Libertarian Party in the Congress in America. How do you guys work with defections in Scotland? Do you target candidates, or do they come to you of their own, or how does that work?
The most likely parties that we would get defections from are Conservatives who are dissatisfied with the current incredibly authoritarian Conservative Party, who have a strong libertarian streak and come to us. But the other one is a lot of our members are actually former members of the SNP from a time when they believed or thought that the SNP believed in real independence for Scotland, and the issue of Brexit drove them away from the party. This is definitely the story for our leader, Tam Laird. So he was in the SNP, he left, he became politically homeless, and then he found libertarianism. And that seems to answer the two questions of not wanting to be in the UK and not wanting to be in the EU. And as a coherent philosophy as well, makes a lot of sense. But we are not looking like we're anywhere near having someone defect in the Parliament. That's really not likely at the moment, but we have had councillors. So we had Sandy Wallace, I think he's called. I'm terrible if I got that wrong, but he is on a city council in Scotland, and he defected from a Conservative Party to the Scottish Libertarian Party, being dissatisfied with the way the current Conservative Party isn't actually conservative. They're certainly nowhere near libertarian. But defections at a higher level come when the party grows and has more of a presence, definitely. And the US Libertarian Party does have a big presence. I have American friends who aren't interested in politics, but when I say I'm a libertarian, usually they give me a funny look, but it's because they've heard of the Libertarian Party in the US. It is nationally known, a household name in many cases. And for us, that isn't yet the case. But when we get there, then you can start looking at sort of grooming candidates who are already been elected and saying, is this really what you believe in? Is this really the party you want to represent? Come to us. We'll get behind you ideologically and make you feel more fulfilled in campaigning for something you actually believe in.
Yeah. So you said the Conservatives are at odds with the UK level Conservatives. Are they the same party, or are they different parties? Or how does a
No, the
Scottish level? Sorry, they're the same
so
party.
there are the Scottish Conservatives have they're a different organisation. It's the same with all the parties have a different presence in Scotland for the Scottish Parliament, but they're the same party functionally. So the Scottish Conservative Party generally are behind Boris Johnson, though they have had their disagreements. And then on a national level, when it comes to Westminster elections, if you get elected in Scotland, you're not in there as a Scottish Conservative, you're there as a Conservative. And in the Scottish Parliament, you're there as a Conservative as well. But you have your own leader who just deals with issues within Scotland. So I actually met the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats a couple of weeks ago. So he just deals with the Scottish side of the Liberal Democrats. But the evening that I met him, actually, he went to dinner with Ed Davey, who was visiting Scotland. Now he's the leader of the National Party. So there is still that hierarchy there where you've just got this guy who is a regional manager, essentially, for the Scottish Parliament.
Yeah. So I think with libertarians in a variety of countries, it usually comes down to once you get once you have one person who's prominent in politics who is libertarian, then you see a rise in. So in I guess people recognize the brand, people recognize the libertarian moniker. In the US, that was of course was Ron Paul, and I guess Rand Paul to an extent. Unfortunately, Dave Smith, as much as he wants to be up there, he still isn't that well known compared to other people, compared to your Ron Paul, Rand Paul, Thomas Massey types, Justin Marsh even. In Australia, we've had David Lynell, who was the federal senator, who was there for 6 years, who was part of Lib Dems. Has there been that one person for the SLP? I know that you mentioned Count Dankula, and I guess, but he's also been associated with UKIP. So, is there someone who's been a bit more of a positive name people recognise who's associated with libertarianism, or is that not really a thing in the UK?
We are lacking a big name, but I mean, if you're making the comparison to having that big person, then Count Dankula is our Ron Paul. But also at the same time, a lot of people don't like him for his comedy, for his past political associations, and because of the way the media treated him. It was absolutely awful, just lies, insults, everything. He was kept being called by the Daily Record, called him a far right lout, and I'm pretty sure he might have sued them, though I'm not entirely sure. Um, I have met him. He's a really nice guy. He's a very good public speaker, and he is known. People see the name, um, and they see that he's running, and a lot of people follow him on Twitter. After he announced that he joined the party, he made a video on YouTube. There was a massive increase in people joining, so he's bringing people into the party. But he isn't that sort of purely political, ideological, like strongman like Ron Paul. I think we're yet to have our Ron Paul moment, but who knows? One thing is with Count Dankula, there's like a celebrity factor, and there's another Scottish comedian called Leo Kearse, but he is currently in the Reclaim Party. As much as it would be nice to have him defect, um, and they're a smaller and newer party than us, but he's based in Scotland. But again, a lot of his comedy it's not about like liberty in the same way that Doug Stanhope did his comedy in that way. It's about freedom of
Yeah.
speech and being anti-woke. He is anti-woke before anything, really.
Yeah. So, do you think that the SLP needs a Ron Paul moment, or do you think you can get to that point of having influence without a Ron Paul moment? Is, I guess, my one of the questions that I had for you, because I know that since Ron Paul in the US, they are more recognised, but they've also had a drop in votes. So 2016 was, I think, their biggest share of the votes, but it dropped drastically in 2020 when you didn't have obviously Ron Paul involved at all, and Rand Paul as well when you had compared to Trump, I guess. So, do you think you need a Ron Paul moment in Scotland, or can you win without that?
Winning is definitely possible without that. I don't think you need to have this personality who comes down out of the sky like Jesus. And I think as much as Ron Paul is amazing, a lot of the commitment to him within the party, that there is this sort of cult of personality. It's like we need to go back to the Ron Paul revolution. It's like, well, were any libertarians elected to Congress during that? No. You know, did he win the presidential election? No. The more successful candidate was Gary Johnson. That's purely because he was, I think, more palatable to the general population, to both Democrats and Republicans. But I don't think you need to have that one person or even one movement that is just forms this cult within the party. Instead, you have to have the party as an idea. You can build it up slowly, as slowly as you need to get it there, so that people know it, people know the ideas, and then maybe people start to like it. But I think having that one person or trying to look for that one person is a waste of time, and you'll always end up with people who want to be that person as well. You know, someone who thinks, yes, I could do that, I could be the Ron Paul, and they start putting themselves out there and end up, embarrassing themselves by asking if it's okay to give someone 20 shots and then sleep with them.
Yeah, I think one thing I wanted to ask you about is with regard to comparing it to, say, the US system. Ron Paul did that as a Republican compared to doing it as a Libertarian, whereas Gary Johnson ran under the brand of the LP. And that's been a very divisive issue for Americans. Do you run in elections under the GOP or under the LP? Is there that same debate in Scotland about whether you do it through the Liberals or not? We need to either do it through Conservatives or through SLP, because I know in Australia there hasn't been that same focus on going through the Liberal Party. It's been more going through the Lib Dems, going through the Libertarian Party, as opposed to going through the mainstream Conservative Party. So is that debate similar in Libertarians in Scotland, or is it more the SLP?
It's mainly a commitment to the SLP as the only hope, really. There are other smaller parties like Reclaim, UKIP are still around for some reason, Reform UK, who have similar ideas, but they're not fully libertarian and they're too small to bother defecting. With the Conservatives, if your focus is on being anti-lockdown, then you go to the Conservatives and all of a sudden you're having to accept the lockdown because they're the party in government. You're having to accept these massive crackdowns on protest, on freedom of speech. You have to accept their very hard-handed drug policy, their immigration policy, which a lot of libertarians don't like. But then if you say, okay, well, my focus is on drug policy and war, then you have to go off to the Labour Party and join Jeremy Corbyn in his fight. And then you're so far removed either way you go, abandoning yourself, abandoning your principles entirely, that there is much more room to keep your principles and work proactively within the SLP. It's a lot easier, I think, to want to defect in America because the Democrats do have a strong anti-war component to them. The Republicans do have a large libertarian contingent. So you're not as far removed as you would be in the UK, but you're still, sacrificing principles to get into a party that ultimately, when you look at who the party establishment are, they don't want you there and they want you to fail.
Yeah, so with COVID, how has that influenced you guys as a party compared to Conservatives? Because I know in the US, the GOP has been able to make headway against Joe Biden because the Conservatives aren't in power at a federal level. So is it similar in in Scotland with regard, and in the UK more generally, with regard to you guys can make more headway against the Conservatives because you can be anti-lockdown on the right compared to being pro-lockdown? Is that been much of an issue in the UK? Has COVID brought you guys more support?
It's definitely brought us more support because people have looked at the political establishment and seen that there is no one in major politics, like opposing this lockdown, except 70 or 80 Tory MPs who will occasionally vote against new measures. They're the COVID recovery group, but they don't have the power that they could have, or the power that people need them to have. If you're looking for a party that's in government and established, though looks like it's dying out, that is, they have opposed vaccine mandates, they have opposed vaccine passports, in some cases, new lockdown, circuit breakers, and mask mandates. That's actually the Liberal Democrat Party. You know, of all of the parties it could have been, it's them, and they are a declining force. You know, the sun is setting on the Liberal Democrat Party, and they're not libertarian. They have a classical liberal wing. In fact, the current leader comes from that wing of the party, though he's had to leave a lot of his principles behind to be more palatable to the general public. But they're not a libertarian party, and I don't think they can be turned into a Liberal Democrat party, a libertarian party.
Didn't the Lib Dems form a government with Labour in 2007? Is that correct, or was it with Conservatives?
They formed a government with the Conservatives in 2011.
Okay.
On certain grounds. So the two major issues where the parties like swapped policy in that coalition was the Liberal Democrats wanted to legalize gay marriage. So David Cameron adopted that policy. A lot of people suggest it's actually, a lot of that was the input of his wife, who encouraged him to choose that one. But in return, the Liberal Democrats had to drop the policy of free university tuition, which basically killed the party. So following the next general election, they were completely gone, as well as the fact that the Conservatives have been campaigning for a referendum on leaving the EU, and the Liberal Democrats had associated with themselves with the Conservatives and with austerity, with the increase in tuition fees, and all they had to show for it was they had a deputy prime minister and gay marriage was legalized, and they hadn't achieved the promises they'd made, which basically killed them as a political power.
Because I guess looking at that, because they've dropped in size, the Greens haven't really grown. The UKIP obviously is almost non-existent. I guess there's a couple of them, but they don't really have that much. Lib Dems have shrunk a lot. All these minor parties that had some influence, because before then, you guys were probably a lot better than Australia and the US in terms of having minor parties being represented in the lower house, definitely. And I think it's been really hard over here, even with preferential voting, to get minor parties in the lower house. The Greens only have one in the lower house, and that's from Victoria and from Melbourne. And obviously in the US, it's a two-party system effectively, with minor parties unable to get anything federally unless there's a defection. So is it the same in Scotland and the UK? Is there that trend towards the US system? And if there is, how can the UK avoid that trend?
There is what looks initially like a trend towards that system. We have, in the UK, there's a two-party system sort of de facto, because only Labour or the Conservatives will ever have government power with our current electoral system. But you look at the whole UK and it's actually tending towards single-party hegemony. The Conservative Party, you just have to look at the results of the 2019 election. They dominated it. It was a landslide of historic proportions. Anything they want to get through, they don't even need the whole party to vote on it, and they can pass it through. And in Scotland, that party is the SNP, who have actually monopolised campaigning for Scottish independence. You know, you cannot put the little slogan for it was yes to independence. You can't stick that in your window without somebody automatically assuming you are a supporter of the SNP. You can't support independence and as your main issue and not vote for the SNP, or that's the way they present it. And as a result of that, the independence crowd, who didn't win the majority vote but are a large voting bloc, I think 48%, vote for the SNP and get them into power. And then you also have the left who aren't satisfied with Labour, who go to the SNP, and environmentalists who would vote Green if they had any chance, but instead they vote for the SNP or Labour, and now the SNP and Greens have actually formed this alliance to unite environmentalists and independence voters. So in Scotland and in the wider UK, the systems are tending towards having a single party. Now that will change in elections. Parties, mess up and people stop voting for them. But in the recent years, we have seen that it's generally that one party has this enormous amount of control. And for the past 10 years in Scotland, that's been the SNP, and in the UK, it's been the Conservatives.
Yep. So, what's the best way to avoid that? What should minor parties do differently to ensure that they get more attention and get more seats? I guess, is there a path forward for minor parties, or how do you see that going forward? Because I know we were talking before at the show, and you said there's an election in 2 years, which will hopefully be post COVID. If COVID's still around, then I'm not going to be surprised though if it's still around in some form in politics. But in a post COVID environment where it's no longer an issue, how do minor parties move forward in that, especially the SLP? But in general, how do minor parties deal with a post COVID UK political system without being crushed by the duopoly of Labour and Conservatives?
So for the SLP, we have our manifesto from pre-COVID times, as well as a lot of new members due to their discontent with the lockdowns. So we can go back to that sort of anti-war campaigning, drug legalization campaigning, pro-free speech, pro-free market economics, and that campaigning can come back for us, and we can make ourselves present on a council level, build that up gradually to become a household name. For parties like the Liberal Democrats, like the Green Party, they're stuck essentially. They can stay where they are and campaign in the seats they've got, and they can shrink. They're not going to disappear, at least anytime soon. They might end up merging to form a more powerful political force, but they're stuck where they are in this system because of the electoral system. So they can get as big as they want, but they will never form a government. It's just completely unreasonable in this climate and with this system.
Yeah, is a hung parliament possible at all? Is there much of a chance of minor parties doing a hung parliament? Which for those who don't know, which is mostly Americans, is how that works. Is neither major faction gets control of the majority in the lower house. Therefore, they have to work with independents, with minor parties, to form a government to get half the control of half the seats plus one in the House of Commons. I guess it's called in the UK, House of Reps in Australia. So how do we get to that point? Is it possible to see a hung parliament in the UK?
Yes, so we had one after the 2010 general election, which is why the Liberal Democrats and Conservatives formed a coalition in 2011. That was to make them big enough to form the government as this one party containing two. There was another one after Theresa May was elected in 2017, and the result of that was not a coalition but a agreement. I forget the technical name for it, supply and something agreement with the DUP, who are like very hard conservative right, authoritarian, super religious party in Northern Ireland, and that basically gave the Conservatives enough voting power to form a government when that was proposed to the Queen, because they always have to ask the Queen if they can form a government. But a hung parliament doesn't look likely at the moment. Boris Johnson, as stupid as he looks to the rest of the world and seemingly anyone you talk to in Britain, he remains immensely popular. And the Conservative Party are the best party in the world at winning elections. They have a higher success rate of winning than any party anywhere ever. And that will continue for a long time. And you just have to look at the size of the majority. Now they can afford to lose quite a lot of seats and still have the majority needed to form a government. And if not, then they can always try and go back, rely on the DUP and see if they'll come crawling back.
So I guess my final question, because we've hit the hour mark, is moving away from the UK for a moment, is going back to Scotland. How do you see the next election playing out for Libertarians? I think it's 2026. So how do you see that play? That's 4 years away. So how do you see that playing out for the SLP? What's going to happen in the next 4 years? What's the plan moving forward for Libertarians in Scotland?
So I'm hopeful, and the party is pretty hopeful, that we will have candidates in pretty much every Scottish Parliament constituency, or that's at least the plan, or at least a large portion of them. So we're out there campaigning, people know who we are. I'm doubtful we'll get a seat in the Parliament, but the first challenge that we're tackling is the elections in May this year to the councils. It would be fantastic if we could get elected councillors, not just people who are defected. But at least if we get the name on these council elections, it means by the time there's a new Holyrood election, a lot more people will know who we are. People might be more interested. We're not going to be knocking on the door of someone whilst campaigning and looking like a bunch of complete lunatics who've decided to form a political party, because we're actually relatively new. I think about 10 years old in total, but the first few years there wasn't a lot going on, so the party relaunched. So by making ourselves a household name over this next decade, that's then the push to try and get someone elected to the Parliament in the next few elections.
Yeah. Before we finish up, do you have anything you want to plug or any concluding thoughts before we finish up the podcast?
No, just to mention, I am running for the council election in the south side of Newington ward of Edinburgh. If there's anyone in Scotland watching, and wherever you are, you might have a Libertarian candidate there. Anyone else from Scotland watching who isn't a member of the party, I encourage you to check us out and join. And that's it, yeah.
Well, thank you, and thanks for coming on at such a late time to talk about libertarian unity and Scottish libertarian politics.
Yes, thank you for having me.